I am so excited to introduce to you today Kristin Luckie. She has crafted compelling stories for some of the most ambitious brands, including Cisco, AT&T, and the James Beard Foundation. She devotes her 15 years of communication experience to promoting the profiles, services, and purposes of her partners. She also volunteers her leadership at a local Alzheimer's advocacy organization and raises awareness in memory of her mother. Welcome, Kristin Luckie, and congratulations for your article recently published on Authority magazine titled Lessons Learned as a Caregiver. What led you to become a caregiver?
Gosh, well, thank you so much for having me first and foremost, Nancy. I became a caregiver by circumstance, quite frankly. My mother was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease when I was in my early 20s, and she had just turned 60 years old. And she passed away almost 2 years ago now, when she was 72. But it was nearly 14 years since her initial diagnosis that she struggled with the disease.
A long haul, 14 years.
Yep. Yep.
What would you name is the lesson you wished you had known ahead of time?
How much time do we have?
Yeah, right. I bet there are many.
I I think if there was one lesson that I could stress, it would be the power of communication, for a number of reasons. One, you know, we as a family chose to close ranks after my mother's diagnoses, for better or for worse. It was her wish that others did not know. And we respected her wishes, but it also, on the other hand, made it incredibly difficult because we were really left to grapple with the disease and all of its implications by ourselves. And I also think that we had better communication between us as a family even before, the diagnoses came our way. Um, we didn't talk about things like estate planning. We didn't talk about things like family finances. We didn't have plans in place, or if my parents did have those plans, they were not shared with us. And it wasn't something that, it can be quite morbid for individuals. And so it just frankly never came up. And I think we would have saved ourselves a lot of heartache and a lot of headaches if we'd communicated more as a family and just communicated more widely to the people around us.
I was also raised in a family where finances were not discussed. It was like it was embarrassing or shameful or something. And end of life plans were not discussed. But I had in laws that were very open about these topics, and they gave me such a great model to follow. We're all going to end life one way or another. It's too bad that we consider it morbid to talk about it rather than talking about it being a wonderful service to those that are left behind. It's a gift when we can share openly and make decisions openly so that they're not left with this vacuum of no knowledge whenever our life ends. I think the metaphor you referenced about putting your own oxygen mask on first is so crucial. So, what did you do to give yourself oxygen during those 14 years?
Well, I'll be completely candid that I didn't at first. And
Okay.
the it took the toll. I mentally I wasn't well. Yeah, I was turning to other outlets. It was coming out in the relationships that I had with other people. And uh, eventually there came a moment where enough was enough. And I decided to go to therapy. And I don't hold any personal opinions, or I didn't at the time about therapy. I'd been in therapy before, but I finally realized that I needed help. I needed to turn to someone else to help me work through what I was experiencing. And so therapy was a big first step for me to actually recognize that something was wrong and that it was having a profound impact on my life, my work, my relationships, physically I could feel it. And so that was the first thing that I did. And over time, um, you get better at recognizing when you need to take those moments of respite for yourself. And so, it could be just having a cup of tea for 5 minutes if I was watching my mother at home, or when she moved into a facility, they can be incredibly overstimulating and overwhelming places. They're quite sad. I don't think it's anything that anybody enjoys um, doing.
Yes.
And I needed to leave the room for a moment or two, I would do that. So it's difficult and it can feel as though any moment that you're taking for yourself is a moment that you're taking away from your loved one, but you can't be fully present in the moments that you're sharing with them unless you put your own oxygen mask on first. And it was a really hard lesson to learn, but over time, I'm grateful that I did.
Was one of the outcomes of seeing a therapist to support you during that time limiting or reducing the amount of guilt you felt for needing oxygen yourself?
Absolutely. I think, there's I always say like caregiving isn't a monolith. And so it's I think a lot of people tend to think of it as, well, especially in my case, I was caring for my mother. And so there's this sense of, well, of course you would, it's your responsibility and you have to do it. And at the time that my mother was diagnosed, I was still so young. I was in my early 20s. You're just emerging from those teenage years. And
Yeah.
so like many mother-daughters relationships, ours was um it could be really fraught at times. And so I think at first when she was diagnosed, I actually looked at my caregiving as a bit of penance that had to be paid for my mother. And so I felt a tremendous amount of guilt.
Yeah.
And being a therapist really helped open my eyes that caregiving was going to be a lot of different things. And I was going to feel guilt in some moments and anger in other moments and sadness in other moments. And all of those things could be true. Um, and I really do credit therapy with giving me that sense of clarity, because I think that helped me walk through the remainder of the 14 years with my mother in a much better state of mind.
That sounds like a wonderful decision to help support you while you are supporting your mother. And it's almost, you know, I might be paraphrasing what you're saying, but being given permission to feel all of the feelings, not just happy to help my mother,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
all of the other feelings. You mentioned in the article that you had a major realization and shift the day you took your mom to her memory care unit. Can you recall that and tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was supposed to be off that day, but there was a client crisis. And so I spent the majority of the morning actually going back and forth over email with my team and with the client. And, in hindsight, I don't think that the client or my team would remember what the crisis was. I do. Um, but this just goes to show you how minuscule it was in the grand scheme of things. And by the time we packed my mother up to head over to the facility, I think it finally dawned on me that I would never have a morning with her in my childhood home, which we had been in for almost 40 years. I would never have that time with her there again. I would never come through the front door and see her. I would never celebrate a birthday or a holiday with her there ever again. And she was going somewhere else, and we were leaving her there. And that was that was incredibly difficult. And I will never get that moment back with my mother. And so I drew an incredibly, some would say maybe too hard of a line in the sand where I just said, I'm not going to feel regret like this again because of work.
Mhm.
And I I don't think I have. I've been really protective of my boundaries since that moment in time. Again, I think some people would disagree with it, but I wouldn't want to feel what I felt that morning.
You needed to grieve a major loss, which was your childhood home and having been raised there and your relationship with your mom that would never happen again.
Mhm, mhm.
And gosh, I think, personally, I think learning to set and enforce healthy boundaries is one of the major jobs of being an adult.
Likewise.
And it's very hard to learn, but it's so liberating to know that I have the right to set boundaries around my time and things that are important to me. Good. Well, I'm sorry for that painful lesson, but I'm glad that you've carried that lesson into your present and future. You mentioned a few unrealistic assumptions that lead many caregivers astray. How hard was it for you to accept that you couldn't do it all?
I don't think I ever, I think it's still a lesson that I'm learning. I'm a mom now too, and I don't think it really quite ever ends. But um, they often say of motherhood, it takes a village, and I think the same is true when you're a caregiver of any kind, quite frankly. It was so hard to accept that we needed to rely on others, and it could be quite uncomfortable coming to that realization, not necessarily because I think I had anything against it personally or anyone in my family did, but there's such a stigma around, at least in my situation, Alzheimer's disease and any kind of degenerative neurological disease, that we as a society we are so attuned to try to keep everybody else comfortable that the hardest part of that lesson was, well, how do I approach someone and ask for help, but keep them very comfortable? It was a very strange dynamic to even approach family members and say, would you mind watching mom for an afternoon while we ran errands? Or could you take her to the doctor? Or and it sounds so strange to really say that out loud, but I think we were really just uncomfortable with making other people uncomfortable. And that was really limiting, even when we got to that precipice where we said, okay, it's all hands on deck. We need to call in reinforcements. That was always something that we came up a bit. Um, and again, like vice versa, I think there is expectation among people in society that you should sort of be able to handle it all, right? Like we are supposed to be, you know, girl bosses and multi hyphenate moms, and sometimes it's just not possible to do everything and be everything to everyone. So that was something that I really struggled with.
I think in America, particularly, we come from a whole culture of independence and valuing the Algernon stories, of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And it's a cultural thing that makes it hard for us to ask for help. It was really a revelation. I guess it's a lesson that I am still learning, that I can ask people for anything. It's up to them to take care of themselves. It's not my job to take care of everybody's feelings. So if they want to say no, they can say no, no problem. But I don't have to anticipate their upset and try to take care of it ahead of time.
Mm.
I really love that you stress to have the hard conversations, and we kind of touched on that a minute ago. You want to kind of review what are some of those hard topics that many people avoid until it's too late?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think sometimes I'm a Debbie Downer at parties or get-togethers because inevitably, someone will say, I just got engaged, or I bought a house, or we're having a baby. And I'll say, oh, do you have a will? Like,
Yeah,
um, so, but it comes from a good place because we learned the hard way that if you don't have some of those hard conversations about worst case scenarios, and certainly I understand nobody does when they're celebrating, but it's so important to protect the things that you're celebrating and that you love. And so
yes,
I think there does need to be in these moments, and then just more broadly, a space to say, or recognize, yes, things are really great right now, and we're successful, or we're growing our family, or we're making this investment. But there also needs to be a space to say, well, what if something were to happen?
right.
Um, I think we need to be comfortable looking at both sides of the coin, and not a lot of people do, because it is morbid to think about. Nobody wants to almost like manifest or breathe life into these big, huge fears, and I completely get that. But if the worst were to happen, um, it's not just going to be relegated to that particular thing. It's what is the butterfly effect of everything that happens after that really horrible thing that I don't think people realize. My mother's diagnosis was a horrible moment in time, but it wasn't what consumed the next 14 years of our lives. There were so many other things that got wrapped up into that diagnosis that were equally very awful.
Right.
We had to sell a home, we had to downsize, we had to apply for Medicaid, all of these just really fraught um, moments that were as a result of this terrible thing that had happened, this terrible, a hand of cards that we had been dealt. So I understand that it's so uncomfortable for people to face. But I think that, I hope that they never have to use it. I hope that they never have to go back into the filing cabinet and pull out the power of attorneys or the wills or the advance directives. I truly hope that they don't have to do that. But if they ever needed to, I think that they would be so grateful.
My first husband died unexpectedly at a very young age. I
Sorry.
was left with two baby boys to raise on my own. He did not have a will, and it took 4 years to complete all the paperwork, the business of dying.
Yep,
There's that's what you're talking about is the business part of it that we'd all love to avoid, but it can't be avoided. One way or another, you're going to have to deal with it, and it's so much easier if it's dealt with ahead of time.
completely agree. Yeah.
Please tell us about your wonderful newsletter titled Caregivers by Circumstance.
Yeah, so working title. It's something that I'm working on in the background right now. I'm hoping for a spring launch, but it's really the resource that I wish I had. What I have found and what I have heard from so many caregivers is after a major life event, whether it's a disease, a diagnosis, an accident, whatever the circumstance is, um, there's sort of a pat on the head, and then you're sent on your merry way, and um, you're sort of left to your own devices. And this is not to say that there aren't resources available for caregivers. There are, but I think that there's not a gentle hand on the wheel with you to say, have you tried looking here? Or this is maybe what you should consider doing first. Um, And that would have been so helpful to me when I was 22 in particular, because there is this sense of paralysis by analysis, especially in the beginning. And I would also say, too, again, there is much more of a conversation, certainly around Alzheimer's, but I think around caregiving in general, much more of a conversation culturally than there was 14 years ago when my mother was first diagnosed. And I think that that's great. But we live in a time where attention spans are short. And so, a piece or an article or a video will get a certain amount of attention, and then the spotlight shines on something else. And I don't think we can make a change, whether that's the stigma that surrounds caregiving or politically or, legislatively. I don't think we're going to see real change unless there's just constant communication about it. And so that's sort of the idea behind the newsletter, is just to have a resource and a community and a conversation around caregiving that people can turn to.
What an amazing resource that will be. I think caregiving has maybe until recently been largely ignored as a topic that needs attention, leaving caregivers without resources like your own on your own to figure out what to do or what needs to be done or where can I get help. It would be so often to have a list of resources and suggestions. So in addition to your coming newsletter, where can caregivers look for more resources and support?
Well, the first place that I usually send folks is I was lucky enough. I'm from New Jersey, and we had a really fantastic local organization there called Alzheimer's New Jersey, which is really laser focused on local support and local resources, and specifically for caregivers. And they had a number of great programs. They were the first ones who I called, actually, when we were looking for long-term solutions for my mother. And I generally encourage people to find a local resource like that, an organization of some kind, if they can, who knows the space and can help provide that direction that we so desperately need. I also really recommend folks find a therapist and a
Yeah,
support group if they're able to. So many now, because of the pandemic, whether it's a therapist or whether it's a community support group, meet virtually. And so there's a lot more access for caregivers as well, which is wonderful.
yes. If you are interested in contacting Kristin Luckie, you can find her on LinkedIn, or her website is kristinluckie.com. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with me today and kind of amplifying the message that was written up so well in your Authority magazine article. I appreciate you, Kristin. I appreciate the work you're doing, all that you've learned through some very hard lessons, and your willingness to support others who are going through that journey.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I appreciate it too.
Bye bye.